Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for tuning in to our event this evening as we are joined by Beronda Montgomery and Crystal Fleming to discuss the incredible book, Lessons from Plants by Beronda Montgomery. It's great to see you all here from all the places you're tuning in from and to gather in this virtual space that has been so valuable for all of us at Point Reyes Books this year. My name is Molly. If we don't know each other, I am one of the owners of Point Reyes Books. And I'm going to start with some housekeeping and brief introductions, and then I'll turn it over to Beronda and Crystal for their conversation. But first, we want to start by acknowledging the context that we're all coming into this conversation from today. That today, many of us shared the experience of watching Derek Chauvin be held to account for murdering George Floyd nearly a year ago. This verdict was a necessary step for accountability, but it is by no means enough to create healing and justice. So we all must continue to fight to repair and prevent the injustices that have led to George Floyd's death and the deaths of countless other Black people at the hands of police. We're glad to be gathered here tonight in community as we reflect on what we can learn from the world around us and the world we want to create together. And excited to have this opportunity for joy and wonder this evening. So an abrupt transition, but now a little bit of information about Crowdcast and how we're all watching here. You have the chat, which many of you are using. You'll also notice in the bottom of your screen, there's a button called Ask a Question. You can use this at any point as you think of questions. For our speakers tonight, you can open up this box and type a question in, and we'll take questions at the end of the event. You can also use the chat, but this Ask a Question box is a great way to make sure that it doesn't get lost. Of course, there might be technical difficulties. These things happen, but hopefully everyone has a stable internet connection and everything goes smoothly. If you are experiencing any connection issues, we recommend trying closing some tabs or shutting down other programs. We found that sometimes that helps when something is happening just on the viewer's end. And of course, we'll roll with whatever happens. The event will be available for replay immediately here and later on YouTube. We'll update that on our website at pointreyesbooks.com. And you can follow us here on Crowdcast for updates or sign up for our newsletter. I'll drop the link to that in the chat, and that's a way to learn about other upcoming events. Just a couple of those to call your attention to that this crowd might be interested in. On Thursday, April 22nd, this Thursday at 12 p.m., we've partnered with Orion Magazine to present a pre-recorded conversation between Rebecca Solnit and Andre Magnuson in conversation about Andre's book about climate change called On Time and Water, published by Open Letter Books. This is a great conversation, will be a great way to celebrate Earth Day. Also on Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, Pulitzer Prize winner Jhumpa Lahiri will talk with Italian writer Andrea Bajani about his new book, If You Kept a Record of Sins, by Archipelago Books. And on Friday, April 23rd at noon Pacific time, James Canton and David George Haskell will discuss the book, The Oak Papers. So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. We have Beronda L. Montgomery, who is a MSU Foundation Professor of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology and Microbiology and Molecular Genetics at Michigan State University, a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Microbiology. She was named one of Cell's 100 Inspiring Black Scientists in America. Crystal M. Fleming, PhD, is a writer and sociologist who researches racism in the United States and abroad. She earned degrees from Wellesley College and Harvard University and is Associate Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Stony Brook University. She's the author of Resurrecting Slavery, Racial Legacies and White Supremacy in France, and How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on Racism, White Supremacy, and the Racial Divide. And her new book, Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy, will be published in October 2021. So thank you all again for being here. Thank you especially to Beronda and Crystal. I'm so looking forward to this conversation, and you two can take it away.
So I just want to say thank you so much for inviting us to be here. And I do want to recognize something. Crystal is a full professor. And I remember celebrating this because there are few Black women full professors. So we have to call this to fullness tonight. But thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm going to open by reading just a couple of passages that I selected, and then we can go into our conversation. So I'm going to read a short part from the preface, and then I'm going to read something from the last chapter. As a child, I did not grow up on a farm or near a forest, the classic kind of upbringing that might explain my later enchantment with botany. But I did grow up in a house full of plants that were tended under the careful, observant eye of a mother with an incredible green thumb. Plants were everywhere around us, both inside and outside our home. My mom's gardens were the gem of the neighborhood, a green oasis, a friendly abode for plants in a large city. She was able to cultivate such incredible flowers and healthy greenery because she was closely engaged with her beloved plants. She read and responded to their cues. This wilting plant needed more water. That one with the yellowing leaves required fertilizer, and the plant bending toward the light from the nearest window must be rotated so it could reorient itself. Mom's plant tending was part of her daily routine, an ingrained part of my childhood. She watched her charges closely in a way that can only be described as listening to them. When she noticed what they needed and supplied it, they responded by growing and growing well. I can't say I fully understood the shared communication between my mom and her plants, but I noticed the beneficial outcome. I did have a few of my own memorable encounters with plants, experiences likely similar to those of other children wandering outside in the sun-filled days of summer. Like most childhood memories, they revolve around danger and eating. The care with which I watched out for poison ivy on long excursions with my brother and sister, the plump, sweet wild blackberries I eagerly consumed on Treasured Walk during the lazy days of July. The nectar gleaned out of the flowers stolen from my mom's carefully tended honeysuckle bushes, a sweet botanical discovery. I had no idea at the time that these delightful days experiencing plants in their environment would eventually lead to a fulfilling and significant career as a plant researcher. In contrast, my natural aptitude for and love of science and math was obvious rather early in my life. While some of my family members found my obsession with quantitative and scientific topics odd, I often sought out fun to me activities like logic puzzles and homespun science experiments. I was never deterred by the fact that some of these experiments went awry and may or may not have involved the local fire department. My interests were formally cultivated in middle school when I had an opportunity to take advanced classes in math and science. Although my parents didn't understand where this burgeoning scientist came from, they were unwavering in their support, driving me to math classes at the local university after a full day of work and faithfully taking me to the public library to do research and gather materials. Just as my heart and mind were beginning to function like those of a practicing scientist, I took a plant physiology course in college that set me on my path, turning my gaze fully to plant science. I'm next going to read a short section from the conclusion, where I go from my start there to where I engage with my son. When my son was an infant, we planted his tree so that we could watch it grow and mark its seasonal and annual milestones in parallel with his own. The white spruce that we chose is evergreen. While there's no dropping of colorful leaves in the fall, the tree is constantly changing in ways that we reflected on as a family. The first year it was growing a bit off center toward the east. So we carefully tied a string around it, attached the string to a stick on the west side, and gently pulled to encourage it to grow more upright. Though as a toddler, my son didn't fully understand it, we told him that this kind of gentle guidance is often needed in one's youth. And for trees, this action is most effective during the sapling stage when their trunks are still flexible. Over the years, as we checked on and attended to his tree, I explained that his exhaled breath, carbon dioxide, would be received as a gift. The tree would take up this essence and convert it to sugars that could help build leaves or even wood, so that he would forever be an integral part of this tree. As the spruce became an adolescent, we continued to lovingly nurture it and provide any supplemental resources and care it needed. It began to increase its annual growth at the same time as my son, whose ankles suddenly appeared below the hem of pants that had fit perfectly the month before. His tree is still maturing toward adult stage, even as he has made the transition into being a legal adult. He has been its caretaker, and it has been his teacher for nearly 2 decades. Yet we know that there are many more things the tree has to teach him and us. I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Beronda, first of all, I am just so ecstatic to be in conversation with you. I am a big fan, both of you as a scholar, as a science communicator, and as a writer. I love this book. It was really a joy to read. And, you know, I have been completely overcommitted for like the last 2 years. So yes. I have like, I mean, we're all going through a lot, right? And so a lot was on my plate, and I had the opportunity to take a break from what was on my plate to read this book. And it was such a joy to do so. So I have a bunch of questions for you. We'll see where the conversation takes us. Sure. But first, I thought it would be really cool for readers and folks in the audience, and for me selfishly, to hear you tell us about the journey to writing this book. What inspired you? It's not the usual thing for a biochemist to write a beautiful book like this. So what led you to writing Lessons from Plants?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here. I will tell you that, and this will surprise you because you and your mother are a part of this journey, whether you know this or not. So I'll just, your mother showed up. Yeah.
So my mom's going to have to watch the replay because she's going to want to hear this. Okay. What's up?
So I have always imagined, even when I was young, I at first thought I was going to be a poet. Yeah. I used to write horrible poems and make my mom and sisters listen to them, even into college. And my mom said to me one time, I said, I'm going to be the next Maya Angelou. She said, no, we don't need that. You know, Dr. Maya Angelou has herself covered, and we don't need you to be a second rate of anyone. We need you to be you, Beronda. So I kind of put that to the side. And as I was saying in the preface, I got into science really early. And even though my mom had a great green thumb, I wasn't that interested in plants, but I got into science, thought I was going to be a lawyer. And I thought, okay, science and law, I'll be a biological patent lawyer. And so I went off to undergrad and majored in biology and really was pursuing law school. But ultimately, once I did some hands-on experiments, really felt that I would pursue biology and started to take classes to see what kind of biology I wanted to focus on. And really, it was a plant physiology class that got me so excited. But really, one of the things that got me interested in talking publicly about plants is grounded in a commitment that my mom and dad have always really put before me and my brothers and sisters. And that's that whatever gifts we have are ours. They represent us and the family. And so none of my family was in academia. And part of my first trying to be open and accessible in the ways that I talked about plants was to bring back what I was learning to them. Why had I dedicated my life to this, to the point of going to graduate school, ultimately deciding to be a professor. And as I started to study plants, I did start to feel, you know, I grew up around this with my mom. And so we would talk about things with her flower gardens and plant gardens. And as I was talking to them, I started being accessible to invite my family in. And then the lessons from plants emerged almost from a desperation in conversation with others who were outside of the biological sciences, even with those who were in the plant sciences. I started to just recognize problems in our communities. I was the first and only Black graduate student in my department. I was the first Black postdoc in biology at Indiana University. And so I started to see all these ways in which we had a lot of knowledge about science, but we were not using that knowledge in the way we cared for our community. So I started Lessons from Plants to try to get people to talk about difficult issues. And one of the first things I tried to write from this perspective was a paper on lessons we could learn about community care from the ways that we care for plants. And I remember I submitted a paper on lessons from plants from mentoring. And the editor of the journal I submitted it to said, you know, analogies are really kitschy. She actually gave me an assignment to read about how analogies can go off track. And I posted something on Twitter. This is where you and your mom come in.
Yeah, I was like, what's my mom got to do with all?
I posted something on Twitter saying, this editor said that learning lessons from plants and how they have agency is not really, that's not the way to go. And you and your mom responded and said, plant agency sounds fascinating. And you said, ignore the editor. And your mom said, that sounds fascinating. I would read that. So and I still have these tweets. I saved them. And I thought, well, Crystal's a sociologist. She should know what she's talking about. And your mom is super encouraging. And I was loving all the pictures she was posting of her chef, So I thought, well, she certainly engaged with plants. And so you two were one of the first two outside of my circle of people who knew me well enough to say that, just to encourage me to say, no, plant agency is something that has a lot of relevance.
Thank you for sharing that. My mom's gonna love to hear that. My mom is she's been on a vegan journey for a long time, so she is always living a plant-based lifestyle is important to her. So that she has a love for plants in lots of different ways. But I mean, one of the things I like so much about what you just shared and also what you write about is how plants were a part of your family life, and receiving that from your mother, passing that on to your grown child now. But I think that is not, when I, as a sociologist who works on racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy, when I think about the representation of Blackness and the natural world, what it often is over the last few hundred years is a very, very painful, violent context of slavery, right? And forced labor, agricultural labor, among other forms, or, sharecropping, slavery by another name, or the incredibly violent ongoing history of lynching, and what that has to do with trees, right? So this is I think the sort of dominant images of Black folks with the natural world is one that is not about joy. It's not about our agency in relation to the plants we nurture or the gardens we cultivate, and that being also part of care work and community work and families, what we do as families. So I think simply having that representation, and I think it's also part of representing the full humanity of Black folks in relation to our environment, because it's not just a story of oppression and violence. It's also what we do in terms of loving and tending to our environment and doing so in community.
It's all of that. And, for me, part of it as well was about, part of it is reclamation. Because despite the tragedies of slavery and ongoing tragedies, many of us were brought here because of the skills we had. We were brought here because we were great horticulturalists. We knew how to cultivate rice. And I think we've had this conversation amongst plant scientists a lot, that it can be difficult to get Black students interested in the plant sciences because of this kind of wrought history. But it's also reclaiming the expertise that we brought to this country, right? And I think it was late 2018, my son and sister and I were in South Carolina, and they wanted to visit a plantation. And I'm like, I really don't want to go. I'm not feeling that. But then I got there and saw a 600-year-old tree. And I thought, this tree has the breath of our ancestors. And so part of this is about reclaiming the contributions that we made, no matter how they were made. They were made through tragedy. And so I agree with you. We still have joy now, but part of plant history is about us reclaiming our expertise, reclaiming the stories, reclaiming our presence as well.
I love that. And reclaiming the full breadth of our stories.
The full breadth of our stories. Absolutely.
So a lot of what I have observed about your public writing over the years has been about mentoring as well. Something that is you're very passionate about. Also, you've acquired a lot of expertise about that you share. Could you talk a bit about the connection between your insights and observations about mentoring, particularly as someone who was the first and the only Black person in your various departments? What is the connection between mentoring and what you learned from plants?
Well, it's interesting because I think that mentoring has been the thing that saved many of us who were one of the few, the minoritized and the marginalized. And that yet there's this kind of unsettling history about the ways in which mentoring has been conducted in a lot of spaces. And so mentoring is often conducted through a deficit lens of, we
Yes.
come into these spaces and we need to be fixed. And or there's a false perception that mentoring can save us from certain things. And mentoring can't save us from racism. It can't save us from sexism. It can't save us from any of those things. But mentoring is important. And so one of the real things that I wanted to do was to look at the ways in which humans engage with plants and reformulate the ways that we think about mentoring. And one of the things that's been fascinating to me about humans, whether they're plant scientists, most humans expect that plants should grow. If we have a plant in our environment, we expect that it's capable of growing. And if there's a problem with its ability to grow, we really assume that it's that it hasn't been provided the things it needs to grow, or that we as caretakers don't have the ability to support that. And looking at it from that context, I thought most humans have the capability to expect other organisms to grow. And so then it really became a challenge. If you don't expect that a human in your space should grow, and you assume that anything they do, if it's not coming out the way that you expect, is because there's something wrong with them. We've cut off an innate ability that we have to expect plants can grow. And if you talk about people and their pets, if you're a pet owner, you expect that your pet should be healthy, happy, and whole. And if it's not, you will move heaven and earth for that to happen. And so really, it seemed to me with that perspective, plant scientists should be some of the best mentors in the nation. And yet plant science is not very diverse. We, like any other field, come from these deficit perspectives. So I really started to ask just those kinds of questions. How do we get this ability that most of us have, and ask why we aren't using that ability beyond plants, or using that ability beyond our pets? And so really, I started also to say, when you get people to talking about it from the plant perspective, they think it's charming. And for a while, they're really going along with you. And then you say, really, you're in this context, the person who's not you're killing plants. And so what do we do with that? And so it is a way to get us to rethink about how we think about other organisms relative to how we judge humans, and how we put these false labels and deficit perspectives on humans that we would never do with a different organism.
I think that's a really, really profound insight that extends far beyond mentoring, but is essential to that, as educators or whatever fields folks who are joining us tonight that you're working in. I think you're absolutely right. The tendency is to blame. Well, first of all, there's excessive individualism. And this is something that I, as a sociologist, harp on a lot. First getting students to sort of understand, yes, we are individuals, but we are shaped, yes, by our environments, by society, by history.
Yes.
And so we need to understand our relationship to other people, to communities, to history. And I think that insight about, not blaming individuals, or not going to the individual level first, but thinking, well, what's going on in the environment that might be affecting not just performance, but how someone is doing.
Absolutely.
And what they're doing. That was actually part of the book that I had a bookmark that I wanted to, kind of chat about with you. For the benefit of folks who are joining us, can I read a little bit from the book? Because it just highlights exactly what you were saying. This is from page 146 if folks are taking notes. Beronda writes, "We would do well in our interactions with others to consider how we take care of plants. For the most part, we begin from the expectation that the plant has the ability to grow and thrive. When the plant is not doing well, we ask questions about the health of the environment. Does the plant have enough or too much light? Or about our own abilities as caretakers. What am I doing wrong? We do not immediately believe that the plant has deficits." And you conclude saying, unfortunately, when responding to a person who has a difficulty, we often start by asking questions of the individual and why they don't fit a particular environment. And that whole thing about fitting an environment, that's a huge engine of inequality and inequity, particularly for underrepresented women, people of color. What happens often in organizations that are not adapted to diversity is that the individual who comes from an underrepresented group gets blamed as not fitting well. And in fact, it's the environment that needs to change.
Absolutely. Well, and what's interesting to me about that is that in most of these cases, we put people through very stringent selection processes, right? If we're selecting students or a colleague, we don't go to the corner and say, we have a spot, who wants it, come. We go through very stringent selection processes and select people who have demonstrated success elsewhere. So they have a record of success. So the question for me is often, what did we do to derail this path of success that they were already on, as opposed to asking why they don't fit in this environment? But that's very infrequently the response we have, right? And so, yes. Yeah.
And you're, imagine, in a situation where, as someone who works on mentoring and helping to share the resources you've developed around mentoring, you're doing something that you may not have experienced. So you may not have experienced productive, and maybe you have. Now, you said mentoring saved you, so I imagine there has been some source of mentoring that has been helpful.
Yes, but a lot of it has been, a lot of it has been mentoring outside of the spaces that I was in. So I mean, I had good advisors, scientific advisors, who told me what was expected. But a lot of the, quote, mentoring I got, if I was on a campus, I would go and seek out spaces that were for underrepresented scholars. And then we're both Ford Fellows, from the Ford Fellow community. And a lot of the mentoring and advice and friendship I've gotten has been from that community. So a lot of the mentoring I have gotten hasn't been from scientists per se, but individuals who can still help you navigate a space. And I think that's one of the things that's been critical for me and other Black women that I've talked to, is a lot of times we have to go out and seek the support that we need. It's not always right in that particular space. Yeah.
So here's another question. So you are an expert biochemist. You've been studying plants for a very long time. Did you learn anything that surprised you in writing this book, or did any reflecting on the plant behavior in the context of writing the book, did it shift your perspective or simply deepen your awareness of what you already knew?
I think it deepened my awareness in many areas, but I did learn some new things. So one of the things that I wrote about in the book, and I talk about it frequently because it was really eye-opening to me. So I was already aware that plants can defend themselves. So if plants are being attacked by a herbivore, they can defend themselves. But there are some really unique examples of a three-way interaction. So plants may be attacked by an insect and they don't have the ability to defend themselves against that, but they send out a signal to attract the predator of the thing that's attacking them. And for me, that was a really powerful example of sometimes how we don't ask for help when we need help, right?
Yes.
Like, I can't handle this situation. What signals can I send out to attract the person who can come? And so that really fascinated me, because those are, I'm a plant scientist, and sometimes the things that I learned that plants are capable of doing is still so fascinating to me.
I want to make sure everybody's paying attention to hear what, did you hear what Beronda said? The plants, when they are attacked, can send out signals, right, to neighboring, to whoever's going to attack their attackers. That which is just incredible. I had another section underlined that I think is on that same theme. Again, if you're following at home, page 120, Beronda writes that another way that plants support each other and ensure future success is through sending signals to their neighbors when they are attacked, and that these signals serve to ward off danger for the plant itself. And when I read that, I was thinking of Audre Lorde and your silence will not protect you, and the importance of speaking up when we are attacked.
Absolutely.
And that being not just a part of self-care, but community care.
It's so powerful. And, I always love the way it can happen above ground, but a lot of it happens underground. And I think about the Underground Railroad, right? And people think the Underground Railroad is about history, but if you talk to underrepresented and minoritized scholars, we will tell you there is still an Underground Railroad where we have to send signals to each other, right, about danger. But I think that is really fascinating, that plants, because I think people think we're the only ones who take care of our kin. And plants recognize kin as well. And so they do communicate. And if there's danger, they communicate. If there's an excess of resources, they share. And so absolutely, I think that is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the Underground Railroad, and also, I think a lot about systems change that comes through political organizing and work. And a lot of that work needs to not happen in public. So there's also that aspect that we can learn from plants. Not everything needs to be on Twitter or social media or in public. A lot of community care and work and organizing is behind closed doors and underground in different
Yes.
ways. And it needs to be that way.
I tell my son frequently that that's what real adults use their DMs for.
Yes. Yes. Now, DMs, that'll take us in a whole nother direction. So your book kind of begins, Beronda, with this sort of reflection on the fact that most plants don't move, right? So they're sort of fixed. They may be dynamic, but they stay in one place. And, I think there may be a lot of folks or some folks who sometimes feel stuck, or you may be in a situation that you cannot immediately leave. What can we learn from plants if we feel stuck, or if we feel like I'm in a situation I can't immediately exit from? What can I do? What can I do in an environment where I can't immediately leave?
So that's one of the, in my response to that question is one of the things that first fascinated me most about plants. And one of my friends who's a writing and rhetoric professor loves me to talk about this. Plants have this powerful ability to transform their environment. And part of that is because they move slowly, right? They can only expand by their roots or move over generations. And I have been fascinated by the fact that for example, if plants are in soil that has a nutrient deficiency, there are a couple of things that they can do. They can collaborate. So if there's not enough nitrogen and they're capable of doing so, they can collaborate with bacteria who are able to fix nitrogen. And so basically they provide a house for the bacteria in their roots. The bacteria is able to transform nitrogen that can't be absorbed by the plants into a form that can be. And so they give them the bacteria a little sugar, and in return they get nitrogen. But they also can do something. So plants need iron as an essential nutrient. And in nature, a lot of iron is locked up in forms that are similar to rust. So rust is basically iron that's with other compounds. And so it's insoluble. And plant roots, where there's a rust-like form of iron in the soil, can excrete basically an acid or sometimes another chemical that makes that iron break down into a soluble form. And so basically they're doing that for themselves, but in so doing that, they enrich the soil totally. And that allows other plants to also have access to that. And so I often think about this capability of us through active action, which is activism for us, to transform the environment into one that can serve us better if we're not able to move to a completely different environment. And though that is a very energetically costly process for us, we get what we need. But I also like the idea that through doing that, we make the environment richer for others who are also in the same space with us.
I love that. And that also ties back to mentoring.
Yes.
And community care more generally, right? When, sometimes going back to just sort of, human situations, taking a break from plants for a moment, but sometimes you do need to leave a toxic environment.
Absolutely.
Right. But wherever you go, right, it's still going to be a question of how can I transform this environment I'm in to nurture myself and also folks who are here with me in this environment. So thinking about how we can learn from plants who literally spend their entire existence doing that, I think is a profound insight. So we have about maybe 5 minutes before we open up for questions. So if you do have some questions for Beronda, you can start to put them in the chat. I have a few more, and then we'll open up. So Beronda, I'm curious to know what is the reaction of your colleagues been like to the book?
Well, it's been interesting because I remember when I started writing the book, one of my colleagues outside of the sciences said, "How is this going to count in the sciences?" I said, "I don't care." I'm at this point in my career where this is something meaningful to me. But it's been I've had a really warm reaction from colleagues. I think twofold. They themselves, you'd be surprised the number of plant scientists who don't spend a lot of time thinking about what they've learned from plants. We publish papers and so I think it has given them a chance to sit and ask, what are the kinds of things that they can learn. But there's also been a surprising amount of goodwill of putting out there plant science that resonates with them as technically sound, but is completely open. And many of them have shared it with some of their family members and friends in terms of, inviting them in. And that's what I wanted to accomplish, right? Was to talk about plants in a way that anybody could pick up the book. But for those who study plants, they would also say, yeah, this is also the real science. And that's a challenge to write. You write for the public. That's the challenge, is to keep something that resonates with your colleagues who know it in and out, but also can invite someone in who's not had the chance to study it at that depth.
What helped you in figuring out how to balance those, those different audiences?
Well, it's interesting. The way I was actually invited to think about writing this book is I was giving a talk at a conference, a pure biochemistry talk, and my acquisition editor at Harvard Press, Janice Audet, happened to be there, displaying science books. And after the talk, she said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I said, "Well, I love to write, And so we talked about a couple of topics, because a lot of the books that come out of Harvard from scientists are science, academic science books. So we talked about a topic like that, and then we talked about lessons from plants. And she said, "Your eyes really lit up." And I think part of that, what gave me the idea that it would be helpful, is that I had started to do some consulting with different organizations around mentoring and leadership. And frequently I would use lessons from plants. And a couple years before I started writing this book, I used lessons from plants with the audience of economists. And economists, I have good friends who are economists, but they're a tough crowd to try to bring in. And it really resonated with them. And then I used it with bankers, and I
I'm laughing, Beronda, because I thought you said communists. I thought you said
economists.
Plants with communists. And then I heard economists. Those are very different.
Economists are a tough crowd, but they really bought into it. And then I also, every once in a while, I get invited in my local community to do a 4-year-old learning circle. And the 4-year-olds love to learn lessons from plants. And so it just occurred to me that there was such a wide audience with whom this resonated. Yes. And I thought I probably could do a public plant biology book. So yeah, the 4-year-olds are my favorite. They're a tough audience, but I love those 4-year-olds.
If you can explain something to 4-year-olds, I think you could explain it to someone of any age, really. Yeah. I mean, I have gotten so much more respect for people who write for younger audiences through the process of writing this book for 12 to 18-year-olds, Rise Up. I really underestimated how difficult it is. It is challenging. So, but I think what you describe this process, and I think it's great for writers and aspiring authors to sort of hear about process. But I also find that the more I engage a wide variety of audiences and literally speaking can really improve your writing. And I think also just the questions you get, the dynamic interaction with audiences that can be brought into a writing process.
Absolutely.
And sometimes in the audience, there is an acquisitions editor.
That's right. You never know. Yes.
Who wants to publish you.
Yeah. You never know.
So I believe Earth Day is coming up.
Yes.
Do you consider yourself an environmentalist?
I do. And it's interesting because I don't think I really grew up as an environmentalist. We recycled aluminum cans, but like my mom wasn't, a super environmentalist, but I am an environmentalist from the perspective that over the past, couple of decades, one of my guiding life principles has been reciprocity, that where you receive, you must give. And vice versa. And I don't think that you can deeply approach life from a principle of reciprocity and not be an environmentalist. I think also when we just think about the fact that, if we're talking about plants, it could be other organisms. If we disappear from the earth tomorrow, plants are just fine.
They're going to, they're going to be better.
They're probably going to have a party. But if they disappear, we're not going to make it very long, right? And so when you just start to think about the interdependence, I don't know how you can really understand the interdependence with other beings and not be an environmentalist. And so it seems to me, I don't know how I could be something else.
Well, interdependence with other beings, that leads me into one of my last questions before we open up. I read your book also through the lens of mindfulness, which is something I learned from my mother, bringing mom back in. I grew up, she would punish me. My timeout punishment was to go and have quiet time if I didn't do my homework or if I was mouthing off. And I started to, because she meditated, I started to meditate during my time out. So I kind of felt like there was, and it could have just been the lens I was reading it through, but I sort of wondered, is there a perspective of mindfulness interwoven into, you know, how you think about learning, not just from plants, but from the environment, and also what you write about throughout the book, like intentional self-reflection?
Yes.
Am I reading this into the text,
No,
or do
you know,
you
I
have
think
like
that,
a mindfulness practice or something
yeah,
like that?
it's interesting because it was years before I actually understood mindfulness from a kind of more formal perspective. But I did grow up. My mother was very much, she had quiet time in the morning with herself, and she's reading with her plants. And we too were encouraged to sit with ourselves and just think about ourselves.
Yeah.
But I really do have a very strong intentional self-reflection practice about pretty much everything that I do. But I reflect on, if I come out of a meeting, I reflect on how I felt coming out of that meeting, and I collect the data over time. And if it's a meeting I always feel bad about, I get that off my list. But really, I do spend a lot of time just in mental meditation and self-reflection. So I spend a lot of my writing time sitting staring at the lake or ocean. You know, I would just be sitting there and someone says, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm writing." And they're like, "I don't see a pen." And I was like, "I'm looking at the horizon, imagining what's beyond it." And that will come back to my writing. And so I don't know how to be in the world without spending time really intentionally asking questions about how I'm showing up in the world, how others around me are showing up. And that's a mindfulness practice, because it, you know, I try to do it before I go into events, but I also do it after I'm out of, you know, whatever it is. And so I think, though I haven't labeled it that, it has to come out because it's
And
the
it
way
doesn't need to be labeled that way.
Yeah, that's how I approach life. Yeah.
No, that I'm writing this down because you need to put this on a T-shirt. I'm looking at the horizon, imagining what's beyond it. Okay, I hope everyone got that. That's what Oprah calls an aha moment. Okay.
Yeah.
But yes, I love that. I love, you know, that sort of yes, intentional practice of self-reflection, but also what you were describing as this really expansive understanding of what writing involves. And I'm the same way. Writing for me doesn't just mean literally putting words on the page. It's everything that allows for me to be in touch with the words that need to come into my consciousness. And sometimes that's doing nothing. It might be being in nature. It might be just being silent or just being, right? Okay, so I know folks may have some questions. We're going to open it up now for the time that remains to see if the audience would like to engage with us. And I think we may have some already kind of submitted. Let me see if I can jump in here. Okay. So someone is asking, I think this is Olgad, has anyone ever studied the actions and reactions, or lack thereof, of root systems in the monster monoculture farms? I don't know what that is. Beronda, you may. And they wanted to know if we could draw an analogy between that and current social issues.
Yeah, so I'm assuming that the monster is just the huge part. So in the US, we grow just vast fields of corn, right? Whatever agricultural field you drive by in the US, it's one crop. It's a vast field of alfalfa or a vast field of corn. And in many other countries and in indigenous cultures, they don't do that. They grow plants in polyculture, and they generally choose plants that they know grow well together. And so there is this idea that one of the reasons where you will see rotation of crops is because farmers do understand that if you grow the same crop in the same field every year, that plant needs the same thing. And so eventually the soil becomes depleted of whatever nutrients that particular crop needs. And the reason you want to do polyculture is that you want each year for something to be used from the soil and for the soil to have time to replenish itself. There are a lot of studies on root systems in agriculture. One of the things that's interesting is that over the years, farmers have selected for things that seem to work well. So they've selected for plants with roots that have more limited impact on the soil, but definitely it's different than what you find for roots of natural collections of plants growing in nature, or people who do more polyculture agriculture.
So Olga was asking if I could think through an analogy between that and current social issues. I'm going to have to be honest, Olga, I cannot think of, I don't know. I'm going to put that on the back burner in my mind, but I'm not sure. I mean, all that I can think of is what you described, Beronda, is a problem of depletion if there's not enough variety, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the need for inclusive environments. And I mean, am I making sense here? I don't know. I'm
making
trying.
absolute sense. And that's one of the things that, yeah.
I'm sorry to scream, but Mama is here.
Hi, Crystal's mom. I want your mom to
Mom.
open like a bed and breakfast and or adopt me, but I know you're an only child and probably not ready for a sister at this stage.
I think Mom already agreed to adopt you, and I need a sister, so you're family now.
It's funny that you say that, because that's what's part of what I say about our institutions, is that they have had monoculture for a long time, and we wonder why there's not enough richness, or we only get one kind of thing coming out of them. So I think that there are lots of examples in the real world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Olga, for that question. All right. Audrey has a question. Audrey says, you write about how plants actively respond to their environment. Does the epigenetic ability of plants mean that they have more resiliency to respond to climate change than we think?
So I think, the issue with climate change is plants do have a lot of resiliency, and they have epigenetics, much like humans, where we have this kind of memory of the environments that we've been in imprinted on our DNA, which impacts our ability to respond in future generations. The issue with climate change is that, much like we're experiencing as humans, climate change causes change so quickly that plants don't have the ability to naturally adapt to it. And that's why we drive some of them to extinction, or they are suffering. And so they do their very best, but climate change is happening at such a rapid pace that often they can't keep up with it.
Right. And, I believe we're in what they call the sixth mass extinction.
Yes.
So the Anthropocene and plant species are a part of the species that are disappearing as a result of our actions on this planet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, let's get some more questions. Okay. One question was, can Crystal turn up her microphone? I hope you can hear me.
I could hear you. I would have said something. I could hear you fine.
Okay. All right, Susanna has a question. Susanna writes, I have read about the way in which dispersed communities of trees fruit at once, sometimes not every year, what's called a mass year. And they're asking, how do they communicate? How do they do this? What can we learn about collective moments from that plant behavior?
Yeah, so part of it is that they are communicating. And so plants have this really beautiful language, which is basically a volatile compound. So like if you open your bottle of perfume and you smell the scent, those are the volatiles coming out. Plants produce those, and they produce different ones if they're related or not. So if we are related plants, we produce the same kind. So when I detect that, when I know that I have a relative in the area. So they produce these, and they can travel through the air, but they also do it underground. And so a lot of times when we see synchronous behavior of plants, it's because they've responded to some external environment, and they've communicated with each other and coordinated their behavior in that way.
So that's evidence of the communication that's happening.
Absolutely.
Coordination
all around us. Yes.
Comes after, right? The coordination comes after communication. Okay. Let's see. I know there's some more questions here. All right. Okay. Here's one from Yuki. Yuki says, thank you for this book. It seems like botany or plant science is increasingly uncommon as a department or field, and instead grouped with evolutionary biology or microbiology. In your opinion, what does this change mean for plant research? Does it devalue the lessons plants offer?
So I think that it doesn't devalue the lessons that plants offer, but there has been a lot of change, and a lot of that is driven by what's perceived as valuable externally. And so a lot of science that's perceived as valuable has to see some direct correlation to human health. And so that's how a lot of plant scientists get grouped into departments with microbiology and others. So it's driven by kind of funding practices, and or they are grouped into evolutionary biology. I think what happens is that causes the plant scientists sometimes to become isolated from each other. And like any group, I think there's better growth when you're able to talk diversely, when it's not just people who study plants the way that I do, but people who study how plants are used in community, how plants are used with humans. And so I think that by breaking up these departments, you break up the conversations that could happen across these kind of subdisciplinary areas in plant sciences. And then also, we just undervalue the plant sciences. When we look at how much money the US invests in science, it goes into a lot of things related to cancer and human health and those kinds of things, critical problems. But if we don't understand and protect plants, we're not going to get to the point of being able to treat those kinds of diseases, right? Because our interactions with plants are so important to our life. And so I think there needs to be an increased understanding of plants. And that's also one of the reasons I wanted to write something for the public, to get people to understand how cool plants are, to be more excited about plants, and to ensure that we have a future interest in generations to study plants.
What do you think explains that, Beronda, the devaluation of the plant sciences? What's going on there? And is that a phenomenon that extends beyond the United States? Or, do you see national differences in that? Or is it across the board?
There certainly are national differences. And so there's a greater appreciation for the plant sciences in some other cultures, in parts of Africa, in Asia, South America. And I think part of it is the more we become more advanced in terms of our, if we're focused on it, we're a society that's focused on electronics and AI and all of those things. We don't see the importance of plants to high-tech communities. And I think that, I talk about it in the book, there is this kind of bias against seeing plants. And so we are surrounded by them and dependent upon them, but we don't walk through the world with that understanding of their importance to our life. And so we think more about whether we have the latest technology, whether we're able to get to the moon and Mars. We think about AI. And so then we invest a lot in computational sciences, computer sciences. And I think it can be the same way with the humanities, right? In terms of we often don't appreciate how understanding how culture works, how people talk to each other. And so those areas can also be undervalued. And so I think it's just this, most people don't have a great awareness of plants. And so it's time for them to think about how they beautify their yard or how they invest in them in vegetable gardens. But we don't really think about the vast importance of plants. And so we don't prioritize investing in teaching about them, putting funding into learning about them, and protecting them.
I think you're absolutely right. And as they were speaking, I'm also, remembering that part of what I think may be going on too with the devaluation of plant sciences, as well as the devaluation of plants, is colonialism. It's ongoing colonialism. It's capitalism. It's the exploitation of the natural world for profit, rather than fostering an awareness of our interdependence. It's the erasure of indigenous people and their knowledge, and indigenous peoples writ large, not simply in the settler colony now called the United States, but across the world, where there have been and still are traditions of knowledge and knowing and being that are attentive to our environment and respectful of our interdependence with our plant relatives and our relatives in the natural world. And if we don't change collectively the way that we are relating to our natural world, then we won't be relating. The natural world's going to go on without us.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, okay, while we were talking, and I know we just have like 4 minutes left or something like that, there are like 5 more questions that came in. So let's see if we can get a few more. Let me see. Okay. One question from Marilyn. For you, Beronda, you said that reciprocity has been a guiding principle for you. Would you share some forms that reciprocity has taken?
Yeah, so one of the most impactful ways I think about is in terms of my profession. In our profession, we celebrate individualism. We do that in the US generally, but we celebrate individualism in a false way. And so the awards that I get come in my name, but they're the work of a team of people. Yep. And so I have refused to accept awards if my team can't be there. So if the department says to me, we understand you got this award, we want to have a reception, I say, okay, well, let me check with my team and see when we can show up en masse. I think about the ways in which the work that I'm able to do in my office and lab depends upon the custodial people. It depends upon, and so I refuse to walk through the building and not speak to them and know their names. And so I was saying to a colleague of mine who's been here for 40 years, you know, this person who works in our building, she has a new grandson, and he says she has children. And I thought, that's reciprocity, to say each day, how am I accomplishing what I'm accomplishing? And we accomplish as a collective, so we must acknowledge the collective. And that has to be an active acknowledging of the collective. So that's one of the ways in which I try to do it most.
And for me, this also sounds like Black feminist praxis.
Yes.
You know, and I was thinking about that earlier, even in sort of the origin story of this book, wanting to write something that your family could engage with, or wanting to make visible what you learned from your mother. I feel like that is also core to what I learned from Black feminist approaches.
That's been one of the biggest compliments I got. A friend of mine who's a theoretical physicist, Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, she has a book out right now, Disordered Cosmos. She said when she read this book, she said, this is a Black feminist perspective on plant biology. And then another friend of mine, Tori, said that. And I thought, oh my God, they see me. Right? Because
this is a Black feminist text.
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we still have 30 seconds. There was one question about whether you can say plants have brains.
Yeah, so
maybe that could be the last one.
I love this question, and this is a great question to end on, about whether plants have brains and they're conscious. Plants don't have brains as we understand them, and whenever people ask me whether plants are conscious, my most interesting thought about that is why we as humans either need them to be conscious or not. Because if, to me, awareness, they are highly aware. They know what's going on around them. They respond in beautiful ways. To me, that's awe-inspiring enough. So I often ask people, what do you think? And why do you need it to be that way? Because usually our either needing them to be conscious is a perspective about us, or our needing them not to be is how we view our place in the world. So I'm much more interested in why people need them to be one or the other, and can't just be fascinated with that they're brilliantly aware.
Beautiful note to end on. What an honor it's been to be in conversation with you. Thank you. If you haven't already gotten this book, you need to order it right now. Lessons from Plants. Thank you for your work, Beronda.
Thank you so much for being here tonight, Crystal. This was a joy.
Thank you both so much. Like so many of us in the chat, I'm sitting here wishing this conversation could go on. And also the strange thing about these remote events is that kind of when they're over, we're just alone in our homes. But incredible lessons and insight and points for reflection that came up in tonight's conversation will certainly be resonating with me long after this is done. So thank you so much. The link to purchase Lessons from Plants is both in the chat and at the bottom of your screen. And again, you'll be able to immediately view a recording of this conversation after it's done, and we'll be sharing it on YouTube before too long. Thank you so much, Beronda. Thank you so much, Crystal, for being here this evening. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much. Please do support Point Reyes by buying a book, mine or Crystal's or someone else if you haven't. Thank you so much for hosting this tonight.
Take care, everybody. And congrats again, Beronda.
Thank you so much. Thank you.